This is the second of three lectures celebrating 150 years of the Unitarian Society of Germantown, dealing with the architectural history of the church and its earlier church in downtown Germantown before this. It's titled If These Walls Could Talk, and I am John James Pron. This is not a new topic for me. I have given slide lectures of this content in the past. It's been several years, but I'm an architectural historian, taught architectural history at Temple University for over 30 years, so I certainly appreciate very much the architecture of the past. But I also serve on lots of church committees that are continuing over the years that deal with adjustments to the fabric of the church as we have to deal with the changes in the contemporary world and contemporary worship. I'm an architect, and the place to begin for me, obviously, is to talk about what does the church look like in America. And this is a sort of potpourri of a variety of churches, some old, some new. People recognize them as churches. They're usually Gothic, or at least a modern streamlining of Gothic, meaning the church tends to be long and narrow. It tends to be vertical. You want to lift your eyes up to the heavens in the interior space. There's a very wonderful example of a local chapel at the very bottom in the middle of this image. Some of you may recognize it. It's on Germantown Avenue, right across from Clifton Mansion. And I really love it because it's utterly simple and economical. It's a renovation of what look like two row houses, two twin homes. The facade has a sort of glue-on roof to make it look like it's a Gothic configuration, even if there are still boxes on the inside. But it certainly lifts your eyes up to the heavens. And some of the windows on the ground floor have been replaced with your Gothic profile. So utterly modest, and yet it works. You know it's a church and not a house or two. Now, I came to Unitarianism not through dogma or lack of dogma, but really through architecture school. And every architecture student in America knows of Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is Frank Lloyd Wright's first major building. This is Unity Temple in Chicago, built in 1906, built only 5 years after Queen Victoria died, and yet, you know, even well over 100 years later, it looks so modern, it looks so clean, it looks very, very simple. You might say that it's a religious building by its function. It's used as a religious building, but it does not have the traditional outside imagery of what people think religious buildings ought to look like, and that is refreshingly rethinking the past, I think. The plan of it that you can see on the right is really two parts. There's the square box of the sanctuary itself on the left, and then the rectangular box of what's Unity House, which is the sort of assembly room and offices, classrooms, social spaces on the right. You enter through the middle. There are terraces that bring you up in the center of this barbell-shaped design. You go left to worship, and you go right to socialize or to discuss. Very, very simple, very clear. And they're more or less equal. One's bigger than the other, but they're really very similar in character. And what's very striking about the outside in the drawings, Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings and the pictures itself, is there's no overt religious details of any sort. And the interior, as in the past slide, is very immediate, very close. It's a space that is conveying the idea that it's very much about dialogue. It's a large space, it's a lot of people, but it's really more theater-like in its arrangement, and it's a very intimate theater. The focus is very much on people coming together in this interior. The other piece of architecture that one learns about in architecture school, and some of you may know this from personal experience, is the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, completed in 1967. And this was designed by the Philadelphia architect Louis I. Kahn, who taught for many years in the graduate school of the University of Pennsylvania, Graduate School of Fine Arts. And Louis Kahn is today considered to be one of the great architects of the middle to late 20th century. This is another Unitarian church, devoid of any overt religious symbolism on the outside. And the plan is really very similar to what you just saw with the Frank Lloyd Wright. It's a square, focused congregational space, and that is surrounded by a sort of necklace of classrooms that wrap around it. You might say it's sort of like children gathering around the mother. And at the other end of this central terraced entry space is the social hall on the left, and that's surrounded by a ring of offices. If you go into the sanctuary in the interior, it's lit indirectly by 4 corner skylights, natural light, no view. You cannot see the outside, you just have the purity of light coming in. And the materials are raw concrete, bare cinder block, natural light. That's all there is to it. I know from members who belong there, Rudy Sprinkle and Andrea Barsovic, that the congregation called it the garage, which I think it was a term of affection, really. And what Lou Kahn said about this space is it's a place for people to gather with their thoughts and to ask tough questions. Again, the focus is on the people. The focus is here, on the congregation gathering on the face of the earth, you might say. With that bit of a background in terms of creative architects looking at Unitarian places of worship, I want to focus on Germantown. And you probably know from the previous lecture that was given that Germantown was founded in the 1670s and 1680s, and it was almost 200 years before the Unitarians arrived into what was then becoming a suburb of colonial Philadelphia. You can see the diagonal red box at the top is Germantown Avenue, and the houses lining it with Philadelphia's grid further down between the two rivers. It served as the seat of national government in 1793 when the yellow fever epidemic overtook the city itself, and George Washington's house itself, really the first White House, was right on Market Square, right on Germantown Avenue. Everyone knows, of course, that Germantown was the scene of the Revolutionary battle that was fought up and down Germantown Avenue, Germantown Avenue was the old Indian path. It was a high, dry road with houses stepping back, lining on both sides. The battle fought up and down Germantown Avenue, but the focus was very much on Cliveden, which is the mansion at the top of the hill. And it is there where the focus of the battle was. Our site that we are on today, which is in the red circle, is much further down below Germantown Avenue, well down the slope. A lot of water courses flowing through the low spots of the valleys right there. Certainly there was no fighting, probably not even much agriculture at that end. It was too reedy and too wet to be involved in those military affairs. Last month's lecture that was given by Irv Miller detailed the 19th century history of Germantown, which was that with the trains bringing commuters out from Center City to the northwestern suburbs, this was a very high, cool, comfortable place, especially in summer. Summer homes were there. Became a beautifully landscaped Victorian suburb with more and more people making those residences permanent. You could easily commute from the many train stations to your jobs in Center City. And so in 1864, 1865, the Unitarians living in this Germantown area founded a I should say they found the first church in Center City really too distant for regular Sunday worship. So they joined with some neighboring Quakers and also, quote, with others seeking more liberal ministrations, unquote. These groups decided to found the Unitarian Society of Germantown, and it may be because there were Quakers involved that it was titled the Unitarian Society, possibly. They met originally in rental spaces up and down the avenue. In 1866, they bought this site that you see in the circle, which is at the corner of Chelton and Green Streets, southwest corner. They hired a young, unknown architect, not at all famous, but this architect, Frank Furness, went on to design a number of very extraordinary buildings in Philadelphia, and went on to become one of the most extraordinary and most creative architects in America in the late 19th century. He designed the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the early 1870s. You're seeing the inside and the outside, beautifully restored. He designed the Furness Library at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1880s, named not for him, but named for his uncle, who was a prominent professor at Penn at that time, and later on went on to design a replacement for the first Unitarian Church, a new Unitarian Church on Chestnut Street in 1886 that I suspect a lot of you also know very well. Well, this was his design. This was his first architectural commission. He apprenticed to other local architects. There were no such thing as architecture schools in America. He picked it up by working with others. How did he get the job? My guess is that if you realize he's the son of the minister of the first church, that connection probably helped a great deal, and this was his design that was built, and it's very conventional, very much the taste of the time, very Victorian Gothic, and his later creativity, is not showing at all in this particular design. That's the exterior. Lower left, you can see the first house on the block. You can see the early 20th century from the cars on the upper right, with the trees more mature and buildings behind it on other sides. Here's the interior of it. Beautiful timber work overhead. But as the photograph suggests, it was known to be dark and gloomy. There are not a lot of windows in this church. The orientation is also bad. It's on the southwest corner, so it faces the northeast. The front door is actually on the northeast side of Green, and on the northwest is the long side of the church itself. There's not a lot of light coming from the north, certainly not in the morning for services, so it was always disappointingly commented on in terms of its relative darkness. You can see on the left, this is the schedule for pew rents, something long since abolished. Anyone could attend the USG, of course, but if you wanted to be a voting member, you had to lease a pew, and the original fees were set at $20 annually. Apparently there were too few members who actually paid that, so a few years later it was reduced to $5 dues rent. This church was sold. It was demolished. You'll see in a minute. But some of the parts were saved. The stained glass windows that you will see in part of our existing church's interior were actually brought with the congregation and placed in the new building. And Susan Bacchius is going to talk about the stained glass itself in Lecture 3, which is coming up. Here are the windows of the original church. and the red dot lower left shows where they are located. The pointed Gothic window and some smaller windows on the sides are vestiges of where we were brought with us, which I think is really a very nice idea. Behind the church, the property was big enough for the Sunday school and parish house. You're seeing some photographs of meetings that would happen on the inside. But after the turn of the century, membership began to grow significantly. They would need to have 3 Sunday services at times. Again, the dark, gloomy interior was always disliked, and really on the site there was no room to grow. This church simply could not expand in any direction given what it had. And furthermore, the immediate area of Germantown and Shelton was becoming increasingly commercialized, and it was becoming just too congested and really incompatible with some of the more meditative church uses. I also think that this church property was becoming very valuable land for commercial development. One of the 2 department stores of Germantown did locate upon it, so they sold and they moved. This took several years of discussion and consideration. You're seeing on the lower left in this topographic map of Germantown an original site that was explored, and that's further down the Wissahickon Valley. The intersection that this drawing shows, that's in the archive, shows on the right, is at the corner of Rittenhouse Street and Lincoln Drive, and on a hilltop on the east side of that, sort of overlooking. I think right below it is where the outdoor well and fountain used to be located. This sketch shows, considering a site that would, approach the church, overlooking the valley at that point. That did not come to pass. But by the 1920s, they did purchase a site further up Lincoln Drive, 6511, which is what we have right now, and that is shown in the circle on the map on the left. And Lincoln Drive was now becoming a very gracious gateway to the Wissahickon Valley, to Fairmount Park, and downtown Philadelphia. You can see the lower left, not a lot of traffic, but very, very gracious and very scenic as it curved through the valley. You can see just below our church at Lincoln Drive what is left of the pylons of what used to be pergolas framing the entrance to the Wissahickon Park at that point. And those trellises are long gone. Talk of restoring it, but nothing has come to pass. But this was sort of an upper reach of Fairmount Park. What you see in the upper right is the house that was called Park Gate. And this was the McElhenney Mansion, and it's still standing. It's a ruin. It's tucked behind the Lingelbach School right off of Wayne Avenue. And Henry McElhenney was one of the early presidents of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he lived in this mansion until 1950, when he moved out to a townhouse, a very famous townhouse located at the corner of Rittenhouse Square. But you could see in the 1920s this was a very Tony neighborhood. And groundbreaking occurred in the spring of 1926. Various people gathered on the sidewalks of Lincoln Drive. That is George Nietzsche, who was a very important benefactor of the church, and I believe one of the trustees of the early church, breaking ground in the woods on the left. Here is construction getting underway. Steam shovels on Lincoln Drive now cutting into the sidewalk, the retaining wall, above the retaining wall, to begin the foundations of the church itself. The cornerstone was laid on Sunday, the 10th of April in 1927. And this is the ceremony itself. You can see the lower stone walls are rising. I see the framework for the main sanctuary itself. There's scaffolding all over the place. A lot of people turned out. There's a brass band. On the left, I can see the conductor with his baton. You can see the tuba on the far left. It got a lot of newspaper publicity. Very important institution for Mount Airy Germantown occurring at this time. The Reverend Roger Forbes was the person who actually laid the cornerstone. On the side again you can see the tubas, the brass band in the distance, lots of people milling around in front. Early newspaper publicity. This is the Philadelphia Record recording the inauguration of the Cornerstone on that day. Again, I think I see in the middle of that picture that the cornerstone getting slid into place. I presume it's hollow, that something was placed on the inside of it, some artifacts. It does not seem to be marked in this picture, nor if you walk around the church today is there any evidence of what there might be in the cornerstone. But this is the event. This was Easter Sunday in 1928. I should say, that was not. This is Easter Sunday, April 22nd, 1928, is the day when the church was finally dedicated, not the cornerstone laying. Correction there. First service. Here again is an early picture. Reverend Roger Forbes in the center. It looks like things are not fully constructed, but people are indeed on Lincoln Drive and climbing the outside grand staircase. I think all the balusters are not in place, but obviously the church is ready to be used. Now, this is an interesting comparison because what you see here is the architect's drawings on the left, Edmund Gilchrist, and what you see on the right is a photograph of the church itself, and some things are the same and some things have not come to pass. The detailed, fine limestone carving looks pretty much as the architect intended. There were a lot more retaining walls that were planned around the drive to the courtyard and up to the steps itself. I have to assume that was a budgetary decision to much simplify that, but we have basically a much simpler staircase, and the fieldstone walls on Lincoln Drive have mostly stayed in place. And the third thing to note here is that Edmund Gilchrist originally intended for the rough stone, which is mosaic and schist, which is so much of residential Germantown and Mount Airy. He wanted them to be softly whitewashed so as not to have a sharp contrast with the cut stone. That was never done. I think most people love the natural stone of Mount Airy, the mosaic and schist, and are very happy that that did not come to pass. It was never whitewashed, left in a natural state. Going inside, photographs of the very early church. You can see the very simple stone framework around the window above the altar in the apse. It was originally natural stone of a slightly contrasting color, and a few years later it was ornamented with mosaics that were designed by Nicola de Chancel Studios, somewhat more elaborate and certainly sparkling in a much more spectacular way than when first built. Altar table, fairly simply treated. This is a photograph of the wedding of Oscar and Martha Mertz that many older members of the congregation might remember. 1941 wedding. You can see the elaborateness with which the apse was decorated. Our tastes run much more simply today. Here's a photograph of the same space today, which is much more stripped down and much more sort of emphasizing the architectural framework rather than the decor. Here's the church on Lincoln Drive. Look at the parking. In those days, there was very little traffic on Lincoln Drive, and you have to imagine the fine Unitarian gentlemen dropping off their ladies and their families either in the courtyard if the weather was bad or right in front, and then parking along the drive, something that is a very dangerous sort of thing to occur today. But even in the very early years, obviously, this was a vehicular congregation, no doubt. Here's the courtyard, again in its early days, with very, very small bushes planted. Nothing much has really grown. Aerial view in its setting. It's sort of a pool of light in its wooded location. Lots of elbow room, which was obviously very important and for which we're very grateful today. Now here's the original architectural plans of the church from the 1920s. And little has changed. I've noted some issues in red here. On the right, the apse was shown to be a curved space, and they rectangularized that. The walls are angled off straight rather than that arcing curve that was the initial intention. I think it's interesting that there absolutely was no way to enter from the back or the sides. The only way you could enter and exit the church was from the front, both transepts, both sides of the sanctuary, or from the courtyard. There are no doors anywhere to the outside. They obviously did not intend to use anything beyond what faced forward. I pointed out the bottleneck, which we suffer with today, this very, very problematic and inelegant connection between the church and assembly room, dining room, something that Lou Kahn and Frank Lloyd Wright figured out should have a much, much more strong connection. And lastly, Sullivan Chapel, built that wing built at a half level. Obviously, for topographic reasons, that's a higher point of the hill. They didn't excavate that far down to level it off. And again, in terms of accessibility for people with disabilities, it continues to be a problem for our congregation. Here's the original chancel space. The altar table is in the back. You can see that the organ was originally to the left of the center in the chancel, and the altar is further back in the apse space. Beyond that, you can see lattice grills on either side of that central arch. Lattice grills on the side over the organ over here. They're closed off now. That's the church office up there. You probably know. But originally, that was the place for all the organ pipes, and the grills remained. You can see an early picture of the choir crowding into that space. There was comment made at the lecture that little Mark Doherty in shorts and knee-high socks is sort of standing off to the side, beginning to beg to get in. 1950s, they needed a new organ. They wanted a bigger organ. There obviously was a great love of music in this congregation through all these decades. It could have fit up front, but it certainly would have compromised the symmetry and would have been increasingly bulky up front, would have perhaps crushed out a lot of other activities and services that would happen up front. But a lot of people very much like the organist and the choir to be up front. They certainly wanted to hear their music, but they wanted to see their music as well. And it was getting increasingly congested. Here's the back of the church. Very, very far away from the altar. But obviously there is space back there. Many churches and cathedrals do have their organs in the back. And that was looked at as an alternative site. And in fact, that is exactly what occurred. This apparently was a huge and difficult decision for the congregation. Provoked a lot of bitterness. There was a vote that was close. Some people I believe had left the church over disappointment that the organ was placed in the back. This was like 1961, 1962. All I could say is, obviously, this church, this congregation was always very passionate about its music. But what you're seeing here on the left is the original back end of the church. You are seeing the fine stained glass window that overlooks Lincoln Drive is now lost to the view. 40 seats were lost. And the organ was placed there, over the double doors of the vestibule. Two really artificial columns were placed up to frame that and hold the pipes into place, large and small pipes in the back. It is a large construction. Again, the window was lost, some of the spaciousness was lost. So I suspect it might have even been more monstrous if this had to be dealt with in the front. Now, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the architectural style of the church itself, because one thing that does fascinate me about this church is, not surprisingly, there aren't a lot of overt religious details in the interior space. Yes, you see pews, so you know it's a church, but if you didn't look at the pews at the bottom, that doesn't necessarily look religious the way we have come to expect of Christian churches. It really is more domestic. It really is more sort of residential. Grandly residential, but remember, this architect was known for his grand houses, and it's got a sort of Chestnut Hill gentility about its design. It much more like an English banqueting hall or manor house from Great Britain. Here are some pictures of some English designs. A Christopher Wren library on the left. Our church is on the right. The paneling. The coffered wood ceiling, heavy wood details, clear glass, and the church originally had clear glass, no stained glass. The details are fairly neutral. It's not a vertical space like you might expect of a church. It really is much more grandly domestic, you might say. Our assembly room is on the upper right, where the arrow is in this picture. And I'm showing you an English palace on the left. That's Kensington Palace, where the Prince and Princess of Wales live in London, one of their halls. These are pictures from Williamsburg at the bottom. And the architecture is, again, our church architecture is very similar, very refined, very aristocratic, very much residential, English, upper-class, good taste, you might say. And I think the same thing is true of the outside. Here's the courtyard. It looks much more like a grand country estate. If you look at that picture, which is again on the upper left, and just a random collection of English, Georgian, Palladian manor houses, country estates from the 18th century. There's a lot of similarity to what our courtyard is and what these estates look like. And again, very comfortable if you know Chestnut Hill and some of the grander houses of Chestnut Hill. One iconic element makes it into a church, and that, of course, is the church tower, the steeple. I'm putting it next to Christ Church because this is a very familiar motif. The Quakers would not do it. The Quakers lived in very simple meeting houses, but there was this desire to mark it as a church on Lincoln Drive, and so you have that tower. But even that is very much in the taste of the English Baroque or English Renaissance. Again, our church on the top. And this is a collection of church towers designed by the very famous English architect Christopher Wren, following the Great Fire of London in 1666. Every one of these towers designed by Wren, tall, profile like a Gothic cathedral, but the details are all kind of a stacking up of classical elements, little tempiettos and obelisks and little pavilions and such that form a Gothic profile. So it's very English, even if this is the one thing that clearly marks it as a church. But a church in sort of English Renaissance good taste. There's the plan of our church on the left, and it's surprisingly traditional for a Unitarian church. Certainly nothing like Frank Lloyd Wright or Louis Kahn. It's I'm putting it next to plans of 3 or 4 Christian Gothic cathedrals. And it looks very much like it. It's long, it's narrow. Many people, filing in are going to be pretty far in the back. Unlike even the Frank Furness Church, a lot of people are pretty far back from the pulpit and the altar up front. The symbolism is important, like in so many Christian churches. It's a crucifix. You enter into the cruciform. You enter into the crucifix. And that symbolism seems to be more important in our church and traditional churches than necessarily being up close and being able to actively participate in what is going on. And I want to talk a little bit about what this means subliminally in terms of the symbolism that the Christian church has developed over many, many centuries, and that is the idea of the path of redemption. This is what architectural historians would call the path of redemption. The focus, the altar, the pulpit, is at one end of this long and narrow crucifix. The main door is as far away as possible, and so you have a very long walk, deliberately so, in order to get from the door to the altar itself. This plan. You are a sinner in darkness. You are born in original sin. Christians believe the earth is square. The earth has 4 corners. You walk through the earth. You follow the path to the altar of God. You do not stray to the left or stray to the right. Lift your eyes up, and the windows overhead are the light of God. And if you keep to that path throughout your earthly life, you will end up in the circle of the heavens with Jesus and the saints and the angels for all eternity. You go from earth to heaven. You go from darkness to light. But you've got to work, and it's a long walk, and it's a boring, arduous walk itself. But this is the path that will redeem you. Keep that path, and you will achieve salvation. That's the symbolism. The Unitarian Church does replicate that, perhaps subliminally, perhaps inappropriately, for how many Unitarians understand the congregation today. That's the original architect's drawing. You can see that the congregational space is dark and boxy and repetitive, and the windows sit rather heavily on like solid dark wood frames on the side. But at the end, you can see the one arched opening with everything else rectangular, and through that the one window that hovers. The window floats. It's a heavenly, cloud-like, cumulus-like mosaic window that sparkles and promises to lift you up. This is the symbolism. You want to get to that heavenly window. You want to be lifted up in the symbolism of this configuration of the church. And the orientation, the traditional orientation of the Christian church reinforces just that. So this is the eastern end, the altar end, the sanctuary end. The chancel end is the eastern end, meaning you get the most light in the morning, natural light coming in the morning, lighting up that special window. So you walk toward the morning light. It's dark in the depths of the church that you are passing through as you move forward. I can also use this diagram to show that in terms of passive solar issues, actually the church is very well oriented. The church here, its long side has a lot of windows, and not only whatever you might think about the symbolism of God being light, it also gets in the wintertime a lot of warmth. The sun, low angles of the sun comes in here and helps keep the church's heating bills down in the winter. These are pretty much all deciduous trees, not evergreens, so they offer shade, cooling shade in the summer, and the light of the winter passes through them to warm the church. So our heating bills are certainly less to some degree because it's intelligently placed in terms of solar issues. That leads us to the back, because you're seeing a diagram of the back of the church itself where additional land was acquired for parking. The entrance was developed off of Johnson Street. The courtyard today is really used for deliveries, for drop-offs, for staff parking during the week, for access by people with disabilities. But it becomes rather inconvenient in terms of the inability really for people to safely park on Lincoln Drive and enter. So lots of things now happen in the back. And here's the back. And there are lots of very beautiful spaces about the back. We may have the grand entry, the grand staircase in the front. We may have that stained glass window that few people ever get to see. We may have that church tower that some people don't even recognize because, in fact, they never really enter the church from the front. You might say that the back is now the front, and that's true of just about every institution and every residential house in America. The front door is rarely used. Everybody parks in the back, and you enter the house mainly through the mudroom rather than through the front door. And you might say the back of the church functions as our mudroom, and this is what you would normally see on Sundays if you park in the back. And there are some beautiful spots here. There's some open meadows that are really lovely. The watercourse that runs down past the side of the church is a wonderfully secluded and private place. The memorial garden that you see here is kind of a lovely buffer between the parking and the grove itself. Lots of church activities do happen out of doors, do happen in the back, before and after services, special events. My own daughter, who's very much a country girl, who now lives in Vermont, was married in the grove. As an architect, I was kind of hoping it might rain because I really love the architecture of the interior, but I got over it, whatever. But here's the parking lot, and parking lots are essential for sure, but parking lots are rarely attractive in themselves. Big stretches of asphalt and cars. Lots of necessary signs to provide entry and provide directions. You're looking at it daytime. Nighttime is, well, we have a lot of nighttime activities. I think it's a tiny bit scary, a little uncomfortable parking in the back at night and trying to access the church. And the church itself is also, from the back, is also barely seen in these pictures. And it was, of course, never meant to be seen back here, but it is sort of a distant backdrop and a fairly long walk away from where people are getting off. And you know, we do have to deal with bad weather as well as disabilities. It's a church at a distance. If you come up closer, well, again, the church was never really meant to be appreciated back here, and we have developed any number of ad hoc entrances to the assembly room. This, of course, is down to the kitchens to bring groceries in, take the trash out, I suppose. This is a door that was later cut into the staircase that is hardly elegant, hardly safe, hardly inviting, hardly attractive, very uninviting, clumsy. We live with the beautiful stonework, but not much else can be said. And so we do have in existence our current master plan that was developed by Brower and Hauptmann Architects in 2009 and presented to the congregation with lots of feedback at various stages and adopted by the Board of Trustees. And this is the guide for future growth of the church, which is really to open up to the back, accept the back, develop the back, and treat it now as the new front. So this, of course, is dependent on monies, dependent on membership, dependent on growth of activities and church school, classroom registrations and such. But it would provide a new entry off to one side back here, and it would provide sort of a glassed-in loggia in the center that would front the, allow you to pass behind the assembly room without going through it, and also provide some lighting down below, natural light for the dining room at that point. And then a classroom wing could be extended off to the back and behind the grove in this particular location. So this is the master plan. Of course, things will evolve, things will change. This is nothing precise. But this is the sort of projection for the future development of the church itself. And as a final image here, This is the architect's perspective of what this might look like to make our back into a new front. So what you could see here in the distance here is the existing bell tower that's on Lincoln Drive. You can see here the centerpiece, which is the assembly room over the dining room, and there is a glassed-in loggia that allows you to circulate past it. New entry, closer down on the left at the parking lot, and a classroom wing on the right. It would be contemporary architecture. It would have a lot more glass and transparency than the old architecture does, but matching the same proportions, matching the same panels of Wissahick and schist, matching the same copper roofs on the top. So it would blend in harmoniously, but also provide a new and inviting front for the church congregation as it goes. That's the last slide. I've talked about the past and the present, and beyond this, I think there's lots of exciting future discussion for how this church will continue to move on forward.